find yourself traveling along an old dirt road in your town, or even in a place you've never been, try to imagine the things that have happened there and who might have lived there. The dirt road you're thinking of might be tree-lined, bordered by thick forests and hills with swamps on either side. Or maybe it stretches off forever in a straight line through a dusty desert. Your imagination probably doesn't take you to actors, rock stars, and even drug traffickers. But there's a reason they say truth is stranger than fiction. My name is Anthony Cherdelli. I'm a journalist. Well, a sports journalist, living in Southern California. I'm about to tell you a story about the dirt road in Vermont that I grew up on. When I found out the truth behind the urban legends about this small part of Sharon, Vermont, the place where I spent a lot of my childhood, my mind was blown. This is True Stories from an Old Dirt Road.
We lived at the other end of the road, a little over 2 miles from where the house is. And I used to run down that road and ran by the house many times. But we were in the process of trying to decide whether we were going to renovate the house that we lived in, that we had bought. And I thought, well, maybe, I saw a for sale sign on the property. And I thought, well, maybe this is an option. Instead of renovating our current house, why not look into buying this one? Primarily because it had a beautiful pond and I'm a fisherman. So that really attracted me.
I liked it a lot. For me, it seemed to be a typical old-timey Vermont home. And it just looked inviting and cozy. I had always wanted to be home with my kids, and somehow I find it fun to play and watch them grow up. And we did so many fun things like going along the road and playing stick stuck and catching turtles and catching salamanders. And I always like being outside and in nature. Mrs. Mason, the neighbor, she helped out like once a week. She was watching you guys for a couple hours in the afternoon. So it was manageable, but there weren't as many distractions. And then by the age of 3, so it was just the first 3 years. And then you started going to nursery school. Then we had to drive into town 2 or 3 times a day, which was quite a bit on that road, yeah.
Those were my parents, Tom and Andrea Cherdelli. They moved to the house in 1985 because they decided they liked it better than the house that they were about to renovate. Like I had, they'd mostly only heard stories about what had happened at the house, and their only confirmation of any of it was from the deed.
We didn't know initially any of it until we met our neighbors down the road, the Masons, just after we bought it. And they told us a couple of stories, one about the drug bust and one about a Hollywood child actor who once lived there.
But didn't it say when we did the title search and all of that, didn't the lawyer find out about some of that? Wasn't the wild's name in the deed?
It might have been, but I don't remember hearing it.
The house stood out to my parents for a lot of reasons. Being able to fish and hunt was a big plus for my dad, but that wasn't the only reason they decided to move there.
It had a couple of really nice fields, had some apple trees.
70 plus acres at the time.
Yeah, it was 70 acres, which included the pond. So it was an attractive place to live in at the end of an older road in Vermont.
When my parents moved in, they set to work making it a cozy spot to start a family and updated it to their liking. It was built in 1780 after all, and over the course of more than 2 centuries had seen its share of renovations, abuse, neglect, and some interesting design choices.
There was an unused chimney that went from the kitchen up through the bedroom upstairs, and so that chimney was not being used, so we tore it down and passed the hole in the roof so that the room wouldn't have to walk around.
Plus, the bed didn't fit. The chimney went right through the middle of the room, and it was all crooked. And in order to fit our queen-size bed or double or whatever it was at the time, we had to remove the chimney. And Dad and I worked with insulation, insulated the roof to make it a little bit warmer, and just little by little made it more cozy. The house was I think, structurally in fairly good shape, but the interior was in places pretty bad. There was like a linoleum floor in the kitchen that was torn to pieces, and it was really, really dark. You didn't get much daylight in the house, but the rooms were impressive with the big beams and just had a great, great feel to it, and a lot of wood, which at the time we both liked a lot.
It was cozy inside, but it was pretty wild outside, which is why my parents loved it. Living in rural Vermont, you might have some tenants and neighbors of the animal kingdom that don't always agree with your wishes.
They were just the snakes that were, and still are, hanging around because of the way the land is there. And the ones in the water tank down in the cellar, which, we found snake skins right next to the water tank.
On more than one occasion, there were big snakes in the water tank, usually adders, who were harmless to humans, but that didn't really relieve the shock of seeing them in our house. Then there was the beaver incident. Our pond had a beaver, or so we thought. It kept making dams in the culvert, which was a pipe that funneled the brook running out of our pond under the dirt road. After a few flooding incidents, my dad had to do something.
The beavers kept making dams right in the middle, so you couldn't reach it. They started at one end, the nearest end, but then I would get down and dig it out. But they kept moving towards the middle of the road, so you couldn't reach it. And so we had to call the town. And the town told us that they would dig out the culvert, clear the beaver dam out of it, but first they were going to hire a trapper to trap the beavers. And we thought that there were maybe 2 or 3 beavers that we would see swimming around at night, but he trapped 11 beavers.
One summer when I was 6 or 7 years old, my parents thought they'd pull a prank on me.
Your major hobby was going out to the pond with a net and catching frogs and salamanders. We were Christmas shopping up in Burlington in a little store that had figurines made out of porcelain. And they had a perfect imitation of an African bullfrog. So I thought, well, maybe if I bought that, I could play a joke on you. And so for the week before, I kept on saying, Anthony, did you hear that big bullfrog out there? Then I put it out there. You were not happy.
My parents felt so bad about that, they got me my first pet lizard to mend the fences. So I got the last laugh there.
Do you remember when a skunk got into the dog kennel? We woke up in the morning and I thought I had left something rubber on the heater. But we went out, smell was very intense, and we went out to let the dogs out of the kennel behind the garage. And somehow a poor skunk had gotten into the kennel, I think before we put the dogs in at night, and they shredded the skunk. And the smell was impossible, and we both had this color of red. It was disgusting. It was truly disgusting.
That pond was where I learned how to skate, and eventually it led to my love for ice hockey.
Your mom was a great skater. And so when on the days that you could clear the snow from the pond, and it was nice to skate on, we would go out there and you and Lily would skate around, and we got you a hockey stick so you could prop yourself up. And unbeknownst to us, hockey was one of the most popular sports in the region, so there are plenty of people and kids your age who were playing, so we signed you up for youth hockey.
Living in that rural community, my parents got to know and rely on their neighbors, some who were involved in these stories themselves, including Bob Mason, whose son Dennis you heard in the first episode.
I used to drive Grammy's old Ford LTD, which sort of swam from side to side on a road without snow and mud, and we must have had a late snowstorm or something, and I was driving towards Sharon, and I could not keep the car on the road. It just veered into the ditch. And my first encounter with Mr. Mason was he had to get his tractor out and pull me out of the ditch. He was a nice guy. He was helpful and friendly.
After all the love and care that went into the home and the fond memories, my parents couldn't bring themselves to sell it, even when we had to move away. See, Sharon only had school up to the 5th grade, so when it came time for me to go to school, instead of sending me there, I went to elementary school a couple of towns away in Hanover, New Hampshire. When it was time for middle school, we had to move to Hanover for me to keep being able to go to school there. So we did. But we kept the house in Sharon.
I was fortunate enough to not having to make the decision. The place was our place, our first place that we put a lot of work in and that felt right, and where you guys started your lives. And it never occurred to us that we ought to sell it.
Yeah, and we did rent it on a few occasions, but we also renovated it at least 2 times.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end, we decided not to rent it anymore and just use it ourselves.
I never wanted to go back because by the time I was in my teens, I was bored by the place. Even living in Hanover, home of Dartmouth College, and a population of about 10,000 people, felt like a metropolis to me. But Sharon, as it turns out, is a historic place. Now that I'm older, I appreciate its history, among many of the other things about the town. The town of Sharon was created in 1761, part of the New Hampshire grants. You see, back then, Vermont wasn't a state, and the colonial governor of New Hampshire, Benning Wentworth, gave away plots of land in its territory for people to settle. The problem was that land was also claimed by the province of New York. Anyway, a bunch of stuff happened that you can read about in Revolutionary War books, and Vermont became its own state in 1791. That is, by the way, 10 years after my house was built. But before Vermont officially became a state, things were going down in the town of Sharon and the neighboring town of Royalton. One of those things was the Royalton Raid. In October of 1780, 300 members of the Mohawk tribe of Native Americans, along with 7 members of the British Army, raided the towns of Royalton and Sharon, along with neighboring Tunbridge. The raiders burned the towns and took 32 prisoners, killing 4 of them during the raid or during their escape to Canada. The raiders were pursued by the local militia, but escaped successfully. Most of the captives eventually escaped or were freed, but the towns were heavily damaged and the psychological scars were deep. That wasn't the only interesting thing to happen in Sharon. Another of Sharon's claims to fame is its link to Mormonism. That's because it was the birthplace of the founder of Mormonism, Joseph Smith. Smith was born there in 1805 on the border of South Royalton and Sharon. You may have known that, but here comes the crazy part. Smith left Sharon with his family in 1816 after the family's crops failed. Why? Because 1816 was known as the year without summer. It was called that because a volcano named Mount Tambora, which was all the way in Indonesia, erupted and plunged the Earth into a volcanic winter. It decreased the Earth's average temperature by as much as 1 degree Fahrenheit, which, while it doesn't seem like much, had huge effects on the Northeast and the crops in New England. That's not all. There's another interesting story about someone from Sharon. How about the story of Charlie Parkhurst? Parkhurst was born biologically female, but identified as a male. He ran away from home and eventually became a famous stagecoach driver in California. Stagecoach driving back then was the primary means of transportation, before railroads became commonplace. The job was notoriously very dangerous, and Parkhurst earned a reputation for his abilities. But Parkhurst has another claim to fame. Since he identified as a man and dressed convincingly as such, he was able to vote in the presidential election of 1868. This was before the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, granting women the right to vote. Parkhurst's biological gender wasn't discovered until after his death in 1879. The events I just told you about in Episode 1 are not as well known as Joseph Smith, the Royalton Raid, or Charlie Parkhurst, but they had big impacts in their own right. That brings me back to the Brendan DeWilde story from last episode. As you likely remember, DeWilde bought our future house in 1964. He was an actor. He found fame at 8 years old as a cast member in the wildly successful Broadway show, The Member of the Wedding. That set him on a path to some early TV appearances and a career in film, where, in 1953, at age 10, he played Little Joey Starrett in the western Shane. For that role, he was nominated for Best Supporting Actor at the Academy Awards. He didn't win, but the nomination catapulted him even further into stardom. He co-starred in movies with John Wayne, Kirk Douglas, Patricia Neal, Rock Hudson, Paul Newman, Eva Marie Saint, Warren Beatty, Carl Malden, Angela Lansbury, and more. But the 1960s were a turning point for DeWilde and the country. The onset of the Vietnam War and the 1960s counterculture influenced DeWilde heavily. He tried to forge a career in music, befriending a long list of influential musicians, one of whom would visit the house in Sharon. He struggled with the mold Hollywood had typecast him in, and he started partaking in many of the activities the mid-60s are remembered for. That might have included doing psychedelics and psychedelic art.
The wood into your bedroom, the door frame had 3 or 4 layers of rather psychedelic colors all over it, light blue and green and yellow. It's just really hippie rainbows.
Yes, DeWilde was into psychedelics and art, and most likely painted the doorframe to my old bedroom. He did it with friends, including Graham Parsons, who visited the house in 1966. Parsons was a legendary musician, and although he might not be a household name today, he's remembered as a pioneer of country music, helping to launch the career of Emmylou Harris. In 2010, Rolling Stone named him the 87th greatest musical artist of all time. His entry was written by Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones.
I heard of Grant Parsons because of the Byrds, but had no idea about the other bands that he was involved with. Not only him, but also The Wild. Just made the house more interesting.
Strangely, just half a decade or so later, a seemingly completely unrelated group of showbiz types started to visit the house next door. Like I told you in episode 1, the house just down the road and across the street housed a recording studio by the name of Sun Shredder. Sun Shredder was founded by John and Jerice Bergstrom, a married couple with musical aspirations that decided to build a recording studio in the middle of nowhere.
That was mentioned to us.
It's a sound studio, but I couldn't picture what that actually meant. It was a somewhat strange, modern-looking building, or just not a typical Vermont building, but I had no idea what that meant.
That studio wasn't just some hole in the wall for the local cover bands to make a record. This studio was designed by John and Jerice and was state-of-the-art, and their clientele reflected that. As I mentioned, they recorded Foghat's Fool for the City album, as well as the song Slow Ride, which you've probably heard on a classic rock station or two, or in the movie Dazed and Confused. They also recorded with Arlo Guthrie and Melanie. There were even a few special visitors who didn't record at the studio, but visited friends there. But we'll get to all of that, as well as the interviews with John and Jerice and a former member of Foghat in episode 4. Then there was the drug bust. In 1979, 3 men rented my future childhood home, the one Brendan DeWilde had once owned, but not in 1979, and proceeded to set up a massive drug trafficking operation. They would drive pickup trucks with caps on them into the garage/barn next to the house, fill it with marijuana and hashish, and send it on from there to be distributed in major cities in the Northeast. After a tip from an informant, the state police and one DEA agent investigated the operation, surveilling the house round the clock for 6 weeks. After the investigation was over, they busted the traffickers. On the night they went to arrest the suspects, they stopped at a local diner where my future babysitter, Mrs. Mason, met them.
She made sandwiches. And she told us all about it. She was all excited when she could tell a story.
She worked at Brooksie's, the little snack bar restaurant down in the middle of Sharon. And she said that one night when she was working her shift, that the state police called Brooksie's and ordered 50 sandwiches and a couple of gallons of coffee to be ready at around midnight. Didn't say why, but that was the night that they raided the house.
That's just the tip of the iceberg for this story, or maybe one leaf of the weed plant, so to speak. Stay tuned for the details of this whole story in episodes 5 and 6. That's it for this episode. In episode 3, you'll hear the full story of Brandon DeWilde and what he did at the house in Sharon. You'll hear from friends of his, all former musicians, some quite successful, about Brandon's life and what it was like for a group of adventurous young men in the 1960s in Sharon, Vermont. You can find this podcast on every major podcast hosting site, like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and more. If you like it, please share it with others. It's a story I'm passionate about telling, and I'd love as many people to hear it as possible. Finally, if you can, please give it a good rating so that more people can discover it. Till next time.